Hello, everyone. This is David Hanson, your host today for Buckeye Voices, the podcast service of the Buckeye Institute for Public Policy Solutions. Our guest today is Dr. Sam Staley, former president of the Buckeye Institute and now the director of urban and land use policy for the Reason Foundation. Sam, welcome on board to Buckeye Voices today.
Oh, thank you, David. It's good to be here.
You know, we're just going to have a little bit of a conversation. The topic of the conversation is this new jobs proposal that the governor has, that he made an announcement about at his State of the State speech. Sam, you've written a little something for us. What's your take on this thing that he's doing?
Well, I think the governor's proposal is really it's the wrong kind of proposal for Ohio, and it ignores some pretty important fundamentals that have been building for the last 2 decades. Really, I think the best way to look at the governor's proposal is to think of it as sort of a New Deal 1930s-style public works project, where the whole philosophy that underlies it is this notion that the Ohio economy is off track and we need state government to put it back on track. And then in order to do that, we're not only going to tell people what to invest in, we're going to dump a lot of public dollars into that and try and pick winners and losers in certain businesses and industries. And by doing that, somehow we're going to bring Ohio out of the economic doldrums that we've been trying to work against for the last 20 years.
You know, I was on a conversation earlier today with somebody who tried to say that this was out-of-the-box thinking. It's not, is it? I mean, this goes back to the Rhodes bonds. Governor Jim Rhodes, in sometime in the 60s, he was doing this kind of thing, and you say it goes back to the 1930s.
Yeah, I think the philosophy certainly goes back to the 1930s, and I was reading the State of the State speech and looking at the details of the proposal. This really is just a continuation of the last 15 years under Republicans who have really spent most of their time on economic development trying to use state tax dollars to fund individual businesses. It's just that now that there's a Democrat in charge, there are different businesses that he thinks we ought to be putting tax dollars into. So I really don't think that this is a outside-the-box thinking at all. In fact, there's nothing creative in this. It still means that the state is supposed to be in charge of the economy.
That means politics is in charge of the economy. And isn't that like pretty much one of the worst things you should do to put in charge of the economy?
Yeah, I mean, as an empirical matter, governments are terrible at picking winners and losers. In fact, every managed economy has really crashed and burned. And that's even going to be more so in today's global economy because it's so much more dynamic. I mean, the truth of the matter is we don't even really know what businesses are going to be successful in the future. The best thing we can do is create an environment in which we can allow lots of businesses to start up, recognizing that some of them are going to be successful, but the vast majority of them are going to fail. I think it's sort of interesting because in the news just recently we found out that Polaroid is going to stop making instant film. You know, Polaroid 20 years ago was the cutting edge of film because it was instant film. And of course, digital cameras, all of that technology-driven development, you would think that camera companies are part of that. And in fact, in certain sectors of the industry they are. But here you've got all sorts of companies that are having to restructure, are going out of business, have to somehow revision what they do in order to be successful in the global economy. And Polaroid has gone from 20,000 employees in 1980 or the late 1970s to fewer than 400 now. So this is a dynamic world, and the idea that somehow our politicians are going to be more effective at choosing which companies are going to be successful, sort of really pushing us to the edge of plausibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on TV this weekend on the State of the Ohio program that you can find on many local public television stations. And I used the example of Microsoft, which was selling back then in 1988 at something like 40 cents a share, and that was about 8 stock splits ago. And what happened then is could you imagine what was government thinking? I mean, there was no way they could have conceived iPods or Google or digital cameras. And I think at that time, you know, the federal government was trying to take on FedEx and trying to deny FedEx, you know, the ability to challenge the U.S. Postal Service first-class monopoly. So,
yeah, and it's really quite extraordinary because, I mean, if anybody had talked about Apple 15 years ago, they would have thought Apple was going to be out of business. Yeah. It was going to be, you know, they're going to roll up the carpet, lock up the doors, and sell off whatever assets they could to Dell or somebody else. Well, you get an entrepreneur in there like Steve Jobs who's thinking outside the box, and he comes up with a product, you know, the iPod, which everybody thought wasn't going to work, and it saves the company. So how do you predict this? I mean, the truth of the matter is you can't predict it, and I think that's what we need to recognize in economic development policy. It's not about picking winners and losers. It's about creating a business climate, a business environment in which entrepreneurs thrive in their ability to start up companies, test new ideas out, but also fail. And that failure is really important part of a globally competitive economy.
Those are good points. We're going to probably come back to this on another conversation because there are so many different angles. The one thing I really want to try to get out right now, what did we say, $1.7 billion in terms of the spending package? That's really going to be a tax increase. And not only that, the total price tag is really $3.1 billion because $1.4 billion in interest is going to be paid through this borrowing scheme. And even if there is somewhere, in this state, somebody who's going to get a paycheck from this for the $1.7 billion, there's still going to be $1.4 billion that's never going to get close to having any impact in terms of jobs. Isn't that right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what this really is a disingenuous policy, because what he's talking about is $1.7 billion in bond sales. Now, of course, you already mentioned the point that we got to service that debt, which means the bond traders are the ones who are going to benefit from that, not the people that are actually creating the businesses and the wealth. But the other part of this is that all of the items that the governor has listed under this Ohio jobs program are really long-term investments in very risky industries. It's not a stimulus package. A stimulus package, in the way most people think of it, is you're dumping money into the economy that's going to create an effect now. The kinds of things that they've identified, if in fact they are successful, are long-term. They're not short-term. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in this kind of a program as it's been presented to the State of the State speech. And, of course, the thing that really worries us, and me in particular, is that we've got $1.7 billion in bonds that are going out. That's debt. We're going to have to pay for that somehow, and that's going to be through higher taxes in all likelihood. And we already have one of the worst business climates, one of the worst tax climates in the nation. So this is actually digging a bigger hole.
Right. The state does have long-term structural problems. So the excuse of this being a short-term stimulus is really mismatched in many ways. And the other way that is mismatched is it's not going to have the right effect. It doesn't address the long-term problems. It just simply continues to exacerbate them at worst.
Right, and I think one of the hardest things that our elected officials and policymakers have had to come to grips with is the fact that the Ohio economy, which is rooted in manufacturing, has been undergoing a dramatic and very difficult change and shift. That's inevitable. There's very little that we can do about the fact that the United States is no longer competitive with countries that are machining parts that can be used in almost any factory anywhere in the world. Now, the important thing is that Ohio's manufacturing sector is very important not only to our economy, but creates value. But it's not in the assembly of manufactured parts or the creation of interchangeable parts the way it was 100 years ago. Ohio's manufacturing sector is creating real value and is globally competitive in the higher skilled areas of manufacturing. And those are the machine shops, the tool and die shops, the areas that require a very high level of education and knowledge of the kind of product. We should be investing in that. And I think we do find that the private sector does invest in those companies. And that is going to be the bulk of where the manufacturing value added will be. The other thing will be in business services. And the government is just not in a good position to figure out what business services are going to be the ones that are successful or not.
We've been having a discussion with Sam Staley, who is a senior research fellow at the Buckeye Institute and director of urban and land use policy for the Reason Foundation. Watch for his Governor's New Deal for Ohio is a Raw Deal, which will be posted shortly on BuckeyeInstitute.org. I'm David Hanson, your host today, and watch for me on this weekend's State of Ohio program that is airing on your local public TV stations. And Sam, we're going to be back with you on this topic, I'm sure. The governor says he wants to put this on the ballot, and it's a pretty interesting issue. Thanks for joining us today, Sam.
Thank you, David. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone, for listening today to Buckeye Voices, the podcast service of the Buckeye Institute for Public Policy Solutions.